There are two things that surprised me. So one is like a good news surprise, a good surprise, and one was like a bad surprise. So Bryce, should I start with the good one or the bad one?
Let's get the bad one out of the way. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Bryce Coon, and I am the Director of Education with EarthDay.org. Today, we're going to spend 22 minutes with Shwetlena Sabarwal. Shwetlena is a lead economist in the World Bank's Education Global Practice. She is the co-author of multiple World Bank reports, including the report we'll be discussing today, Choosing Our Future, Education for Climate Action. So Shwetlena, you have just released this important report, 2 years in the making. When you set out to write it, what were your aims and what were you hoping to achieve?
Thanks, Bryce. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, the climate agenda is really hot. It's everywhere. Everyone's talking about it. So, for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been invited more and more to climate meetings and discussions. And one thing I started noticing very early on is that surprisingly, education never comes up, right? So it doesn't come up when they're talking about climate change being a problem, and it doesn't come up when they're talking about solutions. And the second part really shocked me, right? Because when they start talking about solutions, my mind always goes to education because I'm an education economist, but it just would never come up. And in fact, many times you'd be surprised to hear in these meetings, human beings don't come up, like people don't come up at all. Like, you're talking about emissions and industries and airports and manufacturing, and you're just not talking about actual human beings. But even when you do, you don't talk about education. And then I ended up looking at the literature, and I was very interested to find that since 2010, there have been these 15 review articles about the economic impacts of climate change, right? So review articles meaning they're looking at all the available literature. And guess out of these 15 review articles, how many mention education?
Is it none?
3.
Okay. Good.
So 3 out of 15. So it's not none, but
Good.
It's just 20%. So,
Wow.
So then you see, right? You're talking about the economic impacts of climate change, and you're not making education a concern. So anyway, so all of this got me very fired up, and we sort of made a pitch. We made a proposal to our management and said, look, we really need to bring education into the climate conversation. We have to make people understand how important and central education is to the climate conversation. And that's the reason we started. And let me add one last thing before I finish this question. Yes, education is not in the climate conversation, but also climate is not in the education conversation as much as it should be, right? So it's a two-way street. And yes, we need to bring education into the climate conversation, but we also have to bring climate more into the education conversation. And I'm hoping that with this report, it'll help us do both.
That's something that I have thought about. How do we get this? How do we bridge that gap? And I was going to say, I think that this report does both because it has so much information on each topic that wherever you're coming at it from, you walk away with a complete picture. And, at Earth Day, we've been working on climate education for a while. One of the things we're always looking for to support our claims is the data. And that's one of the beautiful things about your report is, how the data is presented, the collection of the data. And so I was curious, could you share some of your major findings that you found while working on this report?
I'd love to. So we basically have 3 big findings. The first finding is that education is a really powerful instrument for climate action, right? So you will be surprised that out of all the socioeconomic variables, education is the strongest predictor of climate change awareness. It's more important than income. It's more important than age. It's more important than religion. Education is the strongest predictor.
Wow.
And a year of education increases climate change awareness by 9%, right? And we also know that education is very important because it is going to be instrumental for skilling people for a green transition, right? So it's expected that green transition is going to create like 100 million new jobs. You need people with skills for that, and education is the only way. The second key finding is that even though education is such a powerful instrument, it is really underutilized in the climate discourse. It's not being harnessed for climate action. So, in 2021, millions of dollars were spent on climate action, and less than 1.5% of this funding came to the education sector. So we are just not using education. And the third headline finding is that, yes, education can propel climate action, but it is also very vulnerable to climate change. So we actually have to protect education from climate change. So since January 2022, so in the last 2.5 years, more than 400 million children have experienced significant school closures because of climate change, extreme climate like high temperatures, flooding, and so on. And even this 400 million is an undercount for sure, right? Because we are only looking at national events in 81 countries. So they're more. And these students are losing a lot of their instructional time, right? And these are poor students for whom education is their only lifeline, right? And then they end up missing 18, 20 days of school. And that's going to really affect how much learning they do, how long they stay in school. So we really need to protect and adapt education from climate change. So education is really powerful for climate action. It's really underutilized. And we urgently need to protect and adapt our education systems for climate change.
I agree that it's we have this tool right in front of us, and I think the more and more people are looking at it, we know that it's an excellent tool, but it's just not receiving the funding or the attention that it needs. So hopefully things like this report, hopefully this broadcast will bring more attention to this tool that's available now, right? We have the structure of schools now. We don't have to build something new. We just need to implement something that is being done successfully in some places around the world. Were there any other findings that especially surprised you, or that you are, that really stood out to you that you could share with us?
Yes, there are two things that surprised me. So one is like a good news surprise, a good surprise, and one was like a bad surprise. So Bryce, should I start with the good one or the bad one?
Just get the bad one out of the way.
So the bad one was this big disconnect, right, between how much young people want to work on climate and how much they feel they can work on climate. Like they really want to work on it, but they are so constrained by lack of information. That was really shocking to me. So for instance, I'll give you an example. So, we spoke to young people across 8 countries, and these are all low and middle income countries, right? And most of these students really want to work on green careers and green skills, right? But 73% of these young people, so 3 out of 4 young people, they believe that the only way to get a green job is to have a STEM skill, right? A STEM degree. Mm-hmm. But actually, when you look at the green jobs that are being advertised, and we looked at the thousands of green jobs being advertised in Egypt and India and Kenya, less than 43% require a STEM degree. Wow. So these young people, they want to work in these careers, but they just don't think they can, but they can, right? So this is such an unforced error. This is such a tragic waste. Similarly, a lot of young people believe that the only way to get a green job is to work in the energy sector, right? But you have thousands of green jobs in Brazil and Philippines that are in the food sector, in the hospitality sector, even the entertainment sector, right? You have like very committed and very powerful influencers, environment influencers, climate influencers. So young people are just not aware of these career options. So that, I think, was very shocking to me. How much young people are constraining themselves from pursuing green careers just because they don't have the right information.
I think you had some more good news for us,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Can we come back
yes.
to the good news?
Yes. No, thank you, Bryce. So the good news, this is one of my favorite findings of this report. You and I, we work on education, so we are sort of champions. But every now and then I run into sort of the more education skeptical crowd, right? And in the climate circles, one of the biggest criticism they have of this education approach is that it's going to take too long. It'll take too long. If you use education for climate, it's going to take a very long time. We have to wait for these children to grow up to see any climate action. But the climate crisis is urgent. And that's why education is not the best sector to invest in for climate solutions. Okay. Now, obviously, you and I both know that's not true because young people are some of the most active, some of the most committed, and in many ways, some of the most influential ambassadors for climate change. We've seen that. But the thing that these people are not understanding is how much children influence their parents today, right? How much they're influencing the parental decisions and attitudes about climate in the short run, in the immediate. So one of the studies we did as a part of the report was in India, where we gave climate messaging to parents and children, and then parents and children together. So separately and then together. And we found that giving climate messaging to children improved the climate attitudes and behaviors of their parents by 13%. And parents were much more receptive to climate messaging when it came through their children than when it came directly to them, right? So children are very, very influential for parent and community decision making. You also see this result in the US, interestingly enough. In North Carolina, there was another experiment where they gave middle schoolers climate information. And the parental attitudes really changed when we gave this information to children. And the most interesting thing about that study is that the more skeptical the parent was about climate change, the more their attitudes shifted, right? It's the more skeptical people that saw a change. And the most persuasive were daughters on their fathers, right?
Oh,
so this is like such an interesting study. And even in these interviews that we did with young people across 8 low and middle income countries, 67% said that they had gotten their parents to make better pro-climate decisions, by influencing them directly.
What do you think is the best way to teach climate education? Should it be a dedicated course, or should it be spread out across the subjects?
The first thing I will tell you, Bryce, is that we spoke to teachers in 6 low and middle income countries, and they are completely divided on this question about whether climate should be a separate subject or whether it should be mainstream. It is a literal 50% breakdown. Half think it should be a different subject, and half think it should be mainstreamed in existing subjects. So that I found really fascinating. And this divide is not just aggregate, right? It's within countries. So in Tanzania, half the teachers believe one thing and half believe the other thing. So I think the most important thing for serious climate education is to consult teachers. You have to do a consultative process. But there were 2 other things, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this resonates with you. One is climate education has to resonate with the students. So it has to be very locally adapted, right? It has to be in sync with what they are seeing, what they're experiencing in their local ecosystem, in their local community. And so related to that is this idea that it should be hands-on, right? And some of the best climate education programs that we came across, that we saw there was a lot of enthusiasm for, were these very hands-on programs, right? Tree planting. Tree planting is extremely popular as sort of a climate education strategy, and students love it. But then also we saw very innovative examples of things like, waste management initiatives that students are doing, recycling, and they're also extremely interested in local knowledge, right? So this again goes to the point of it being contextual. So we saw this great example in New Zealand where they are having students talk to the local Maori leaders, right? And have them kind of learn from them. So I think students are very enthusiastic about practical, hands-on, contextual work where they also get to interact with local leaders, local knowledge. And the final thing I will say is that climate education is great. It's really important. But what we also have to understand is that education in and of itself is really good for climate outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. So as an economist and not an education expert, one of the things I have encountered, which has really surprised me, is that a lot of people think that the only way education can help is through climate education. You know what I mean? And I think climate education is extremely important, but we should also remember that education as a whole is really important, right? And this point that I mentioned at the beginning, that 9% increase in climate change awareness with one additional year of education, that's for general education, not just climate education, right? And so related to that is the point that in a lot of low and middle income countries where I work, students are really struggling to master basic competencies like literacy and numeracy. So what for me is a danger sign is that as we push this idea of climate education, it should not crowd out the focus from foundational skills like literacy and numeracy, right? So you have 70% of students who cannot read for meaning by age 10, right? Which is so tricky because if you can't learn to read, how will you read to learn, right, in the future? Mm-hmm. So we have to kind of really focus on that, but we can do that focus through climate material as well, right? So our big recommendation is make sure you protect foundational skills, the focus on foundational skills, and use climate curriculum, use climate ideas and information to strengthen literacy and numeracy.
I think integrating across subjects and interdisciplinary approach addresses the concern that you brought up earlier, that this idea that if I want a green job, it needs to be in the STEM. So that's one advantage of, I think, incorporating it into other subjects. So people are looking at the climate crisis or climate solutions or green jobs from different angles. But on the flip side of that, we know that, the top two reasons that teachers aren't teaching climate education is that they don't believe it aligns with their subject, or that they don't have the training. And so, we need to build that competency and tell non-STEM teachers, you don't need to know all the science behind the climate crisis to introduce this to your students. We recently released a document called A School's Guide to Climate Education, which was meant to be an entry point for teachers, where as a school, you bring together all teachers in all subjects and you have them consider things like, what would green jobs look like from your discipline, and brainstorm together and then incorporate that lesson into your classes. So hopefully it can address that concern that you brought up earlier.
That is such a brilliant idea. That's really good. And I'll look up your resources. I think that would be very useful for a lot of our country counterparts as well.
What about parents and students and teachers or educators listening to this? What could they do to support your work and our work on climate education?
One is, I think we just have to talk more to students about climate openly. And I do think in this respect, I think in the US, I'm seeing much more of an open conversation. But I think in a lot of low and middle income countries, I think we have a way to go. But then I think the other thing we have to do is we have to steer them away from the sense of nihilism, right? Because sometimes learning about climate change can be so overwhelming and can leave you with the sense of panic and despair. And we want to really steer them away from it. So I think even in climate education, even in our conversations, even in our resources, I think we must uplift and highlight the solution-oriented work that's happening. And there's tremendous solution work-oriented solution-oriented work happening everywhere. So I think that is my biggest advice, that we should talk to them, but then we should also really steer them towards solutions, ideas for solutions, and action, right? So some of the most positive work I have seen, uplifting work I have seen, is where young people are then engaged in some kind of, after school activity, in school activity, group activity, community activity.
So I guess lastly, on a personal note, it sounds like you have a lot of your work cut out for you with this report. What are some things that you're most looking forward to for sharing this report, or next steps that you could share with us?
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to getting on the road with this, and it's the best part of doing a report like this is then to talk to people about it and hopefully not bore them, but have a conversation like we had. I really enjoyed it. So, and like I said, there are two very different kinds of conversations I'm looking forward to having. One with the students and the young people. I really enjoyed working on the data with these young people, but I think just listening to some of the work that's already happening and thinking of how we can scale it up. I think that's going to be very exciting. But then also with governments. And like I said, I'm ready for the skeptics. I'm ready for the skeptical governments as well. So I'm really looking forward to getting into the policy-making conversation about how to make this concrete and see it happen at the ground.
That's very exciting, and very much looking forward to supporting that in any way that we can. Shwetlena, thank you so much for joining us, for all of your work on this report, for all your work on climate education. It's an amazing report. If you're watching this and you haven't read it yet, you should definitely check it out. Shwetlena, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to earthsday.org. You guys are doing a fantastic job, and I'm looking forward to building on the work that you've done, disseminating in our countries. And thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.